WBTM, and a discussion I've been looking forward to. Dr. Mike Moore, glad to have you in here to share some memories about Andy Griffith. You and I have had a number of discussions about your dad, who lived sort of a Mayberry life in Mount Airy.
He did.
As an entrepreneur, we've discussed that, and I've enjoyed that. And I wanted to get you in here to do a tribute to Andy Griffith, not just because he was a cultural icon and so multi-talented, but because he remained a traditional Southerner the way Southerners were back in his day all through his life. And Hollywood didn't change him, did it?
They really didn't. And in fact, it's a privilege to come to talk about Andy. And indeed, what you read and have heard in the past few days is his tremendous respect for North Carolina, for people, and for his privilege of serving or having the role and of entertaining people. He also had tremendous respect for the individual characters he created, and he spent a lot of time, and this has been in some of the recent news stories, that when he moved from the Andy Griffith Show, Andy Taylor, to Matlock, he was careful not to, as you say, cross-pollinate those two. He wanted each one to be a freestanding independent character, but that truly just reflected a lot of respect that probably came from almost an inadvertent upbringing within a church world, and that came from his interest in music.
And you knew about his upbringing because you were raised the same way, in the same place, by the same families. Tell us a bit about the Mayberry background that you came from and how you, what you heard of him and experienced him as a storyteller even back then.
Well, Mayberry, first of all, is truly a fictitious location.
Based on Mount Airy, right?
Well, we grew up in Mount Airy, so you're a product of your upbringing, as it were. So if someone created a new show and it seemed to be like Danville, obviously your living in Danville is going to affect what you put into that show. But indeed, we grew up next door to one another. The homes of my grandmother, my family, and then Andy's family were literally one next to the other on a street known as Haymore Street. If you've been to Mount Airy and you see the gigantic water tank, which actually is now a city logo, with a Andy Griffith Show logo painted on this gigantic water tank, we lived on the street at the foot of the water tank on the hill in Mount Airy, Haymore Street. So we grew up, at that time, this was again in the 1940s. Andy graduated from high school in Mount Airy in 1944, and indeed went on to Carolina, UNC Chapel Hill, that year, being the first in the family to ever have done that. At Chapel Hill, he actually went to Chapel Hill wanting to be a minister, a preacher.
And a preacher was one of the earliest influences in his life in terms of his relationship with God, his love of music. How'd that get started before he went to Carolina?
Well, and it started almost inadvertently. The story goes, and I've never had the opportunity to have asked Andy this, but he really liked swing music. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, that was the music of the late 30s or early 40s particularly, and he wanted to learn to play the trombone. So he ordered a trombone after saving his money. It was $30-odd from what then was the Spiegel's catalog.
I remember that.
People now don't realize that back in those days, if you wanted almost anything living in a southern community, you had to, quote, order it from either Sears Roebuck or something like Spiegel or one called the Bennett Blue Book. At any rate, he got the trombone, and it turned out that in Mount Airy, we had a Moravian congregation. Now, the home church for the Moravian church is Winston-Salem, and this is basically a religious order, Christian mail order, and they are big on brass bands. They play religious music. It's a wonderful thing. Andy had heard the band play and assumed that would be who could teach him to play the trombone. So he rode his bike some 3 miles from his home on the south side to the Grace Moravian Church on the north side of Mount Airy, right literally through town, lots of hills. It's a tough ride. And indeed, holding the trombone, sat on the steps one morning until Reverend Mackey, that's M-A-C-K-E-Y, came into the church and approached him on the steps, true story, would he teach him the trombone? This is about a 16-year-old kid. A lot of big shock of brown hair, probably needing a haircut. All the pictures looked that way. And indeed, Reverend Mackey said yes, so they began, I suppose, weekly lessons with Andy riding the 3 miles each way. Fortunately, Reverend Mackey became the music director to a second church, the Central Methodist Church, which was a halfway between, and Andy continued in their choir, etc.
And so Andy gets interested in music. He also, because church was a big influence in his life, goes to Carolina thinking about being a major in their ministerial program, and then switches to music.
He does, and I don't know all the nuances. He became involved with the Carolina Playmakers, their dramatic group, and did a series of roles of Gilbert and Sullivan, which just happened to be what the Playmakers were doing those years. But in that role, he moved from what would have been a predominant probable English theological background. It's interesting, UNC Chapel Hill has always had one of the strongest religious departments, even being a government or state-owned school. But he moved to music, and in order to again, he had to work his way through. He was a busboy in Lenore Hall, if you're familiar with Chapel Hill. So he basically was given, if you will, grants and aids that we now know them, some scholarships. The family was basically very blue collar. His dad worked in a furniture factory, an hourly wage. Mother stayed at home, Geneva. And indeed, it was a struggle to get through college. In the summers, he began working as a playmaker member at the Lost Colony on Roanoke Island. Paul Green, who was a professor at that time, had written the Lost Colony play, and indeed Andy would go in the summers, was paid to do that, could save some money, but that introduced him to Roanoke Island, where he, after eventually being able to have income, bought a home where indeed he not only lived, but this week was actually buried in that area, not necessarily on the estate.
We're talking to Dr. Mike Moore this morning, remembering Andy Griffith, having grown up with him and experienced his Hollywood days as you did. So he goes to Carolina thinking he's going to study in their, yes, they do have a very serious religion department there. Their professors are very well noted. Switches to music, then needing a part-time job, starts acting, discovers his acting ability, and after that, when he gets out of school, though, ironically, he gets a job as a teacher, doesn't he?
He did. He met his first wife, Barbara, there at the Lost Colony, and she was at the Playmakers, and they were married. And he took a job. They both took a job in Goldsboro, North Carolina. He was a music teacher in the high school, and it turns out an English teacher. Most people taught 2 subjects. There, they entered into beginning to do stand-up comedy as we would know it, but he was asked by a friend from Carolina if he could actually do a monologue for groups that came for dinner programs. And he came up with this initial monologue. What it was football.
Which is legendary.
And this young man from Carolina, and if you're interested, you can go on the Daily Tar Heel website, which is the UNC newspaper. There's a wonderful rendition of that. Just follow the links about this story. But this fellow actually was the one who had it originally recorded, and eventually Andy, after several productive presentations, did it before a large insurance group. That eventually led to him and Barbara going on what then was the Southeastern Supper Club route or tour. Mm-hmm. And at that point, there were like 6 of these in the Southeast. One was the old Plantation Club in Greensboro, where he was actually performing. Parallel to this, independent of that, Lee Kynard, who was many may
TV
know,
guy, yeah.
TV guy from Channel 2, I had a Capitol recording person there visiting Channel 2. They happened to go out to dinner at the Supper Club. Andy did his bit, and the rest was history.
Wow.
Lee asked him over, the story goes, and he met the Capitol people, and actually that led him to a true first initial record recording contract, which is where it really started.
So he started the record recording. I guess teaching was out of the way then. Then, before he went to television, though, did he go to Broadway first? Or was
he did,
right?
And the magic there was getting a nationally recognized manager, Richard Link. Mm-hmm. And once Mr. Link started working with Andy, of course, he was looking for opportunities. It led him initially to doing a TV show. Back then it was U.S. Steel Hour, and indeed he did a 1-hour No Time for Sergeants. I can distinctly remember us driving to Greensboro from Mount Airy. We wore our suits and ties. I was, 12 years old or so, and we sat in the the WFMY studios, watched a closed circuit because we didn't have TV in Mount Airy then, as we do now, and indeed we watched the show on closed circuit TV. That led then to the Broadway show, No Time for Sergeants. And the other one he did was Destry Rides Again. And this ran for a year and a half. It was the original Paul Colbert show that had been produced years before. And indeed, that led then to the Broadway No Time for Sergeant, which is the original Will Stockton character.
We're talking with Dr. Mike Moore this morning and remembering Andy Griffith, the unbelievable talent that he had, the genuineness that anyone who met him, ever wrote about him, ever interviewed him, said he was the real deal. So he's on Broadway. He's already got a successful recording, a record album of comedy. That would be enough career for most people. So while he's on Broadway, how did he get to Danny Thomas for the guest shot on that show? Is that
well? The story goes, and I assume this is correct. This is what the family was always told: is that Danny Thomas came to the theater to see No Time for Sergeants, and subsequently came up with the idea that they could do a skit, do a show on Make Room for Daddy. So Andy then went and did that, which was Danny Thomas being arrested for speeding in Mayberry. And from that, it spun off that the show began. And indeed, it ran for 8 seasons, extremely successful. It's interesting that Andy's show, along with Seinfeld and Happy Days, were 3 of the only shows that ever stopped production when they were at their height. But Andy was, again, so, you can use the term respectful, that he didn't want the show to dwindle down, because with any type of dramatic production on a recurring basis, unfortunately, you run out of storylines. You see it with Law and Order, you see it with anyone, and of course that's now known in the business as jumping the shark. That is when you decide that a show has maxed out its real growth potential. So Andy actually made the decision to close the show. They did one return, and then unfortunately, and this is in most of the public media, he developed a neurological problem, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is weakness in your legs.
I remember that.
He was incapacitated for, months, but recovered. He developed or opened a production company, Andy Griffith Enterprises, and indeed for several years and series of TV shows that none of which really caught on. This was like The Headmaster and things most of us don't even remember. He tried to do several movies, and none of these clicked until he came up, I don't know who originated this, but the concept of Matlock. Mm-hmm. And many people thought, we thought this initially, that Matlock was an evolution of Andy Taylor getting older, going to law school, but it really wasn't. It was a separate, independent character, a Southern attorney based in Atlanta. But as it turns out, Andy moved the production company from Los Angeles back to Wilmington. And there is a sub-theme in that show in which he really come from a smaller town, and a lot of the stuff is there. The eating the hot dogs like my dad had at the Wienerburger, etc.
We're talking with Dr. Mike Moore this morning, and before we get into the Matlock any further, I want to go back and revisit Mount Airy, nay Mayberry, and his connection with Hollywood. You have memories of him coming home when the show, in between production runs, and then sitting around, and your dad was quite the storyteller. So was Andy. There were various other, I think he had at least one grandmother or somebody in the family who was a story. Tell us about some of those meetings that they had, coming up with story ideas.
Absolutely. When the Andy Griffith show was beginning, that, and I don't recall what year that was. It was in the early 60s. After the first season, the summer afterwards, Andy and Barbara came home to Mount Airy. They brought again Dick Link, Richard Link, his agent, and they brought a man named Mr. Sweeney, Bob Sweeney, who was Andy's producer there. And they stayed for a week. The two agents and stuff stayed at the Bluebird Motel in Danville, then the place to eat on Sunday nights. And indeed, every day at 9 o'clock in the morning, we would gather in my grandmother, Gracie Moore, nicknamed Gege, her front room, known as the sunroom, and with a Wollensack tape recorder running, that's what basically the agent ran, was a tape recorder, sitting in the floor. It was no air conditioning. Andy would pick at my dad, even more, Andy's dad, Carl Griffith, about family stories. And indeed, he would ask about whatever happened to Lindley Gilbert, and he used to make moonshine or something up near Hillsville. Yeah, let me tell you about that. And they'd start laughing and talking. And Andy, this tape recorder's running. Indeed, my grandmother, that's Gege, she played the guitar, and she would record songs for them, and they would sit and try to figure out the chords. And Andy, in fact, while he was a fairly accomplished brass instrument player, was never a really accomplished guitar player, but my grandmother would write down what he should do that ended up on the show. The tapes were taken literally in a briefcase back to Hollywood. They had transcriptionists type every word. They were put in notebooks, and then what you would call writers would take that and pull out themes. Mm-hmm. Every Monday morning, this went on for several years. The group met first thing on Monday. They had a list of themes. They decided what they would do. The whole cast sat around a table talking about who would do what, when, Don Knotts, the rest of them. And the next morning, the writers came back with a draft monologue. This is Tuesday. They went through it again. On Wednesday, there was a dry run. Thursday, they laid it down. And Friday, they went home. And this recurred each week based on the stories out of Mount Airy.
Now, very quickly, to get back to the guitar and your grandmother, which I think is such a neat story, was she just coming up with tunes that were background for the show, or was she writing songs that have lyrics?
These are old-timey songs. These are vignettes, all classic old-time songs. Wayfaring Strangers, songs that we recognize still in our area here, that she would start playing, or some of the fast things these things. I'm blocking the name of the one I know he plays on the porch several times, but they would take these and then they would basically try to make them better. He's been said in the many blogs recently to have really represented bluegrass music before there was bluegrass music. And he always went back to this, even when he brought the group known on the show as the Darlings. They were a very popular bluegrass three-piece group, if you would, in California. But again, he showcased them for almost a season.
I remember that.
Using the fine actor who was the dad of the group. But again, that came back to his musical heritage. Music is all through the Andy Griffith Show in different formats and in different forms.
Because it was all through his life.
It was the key. And it's interesting, as Andy grew older, his actual last greatest production number was his gospel album, I Love to Tell the Story, that actually won a Grammy Award just a few years ago. And it's almost like Andy, through his initial respect for Reverend Mackey and the church, he brought his entire life back full circle, because he actually, it is said, turned down numerous commercial interest in the last 10 years, and he only chose to do what he wanted to do, which indeed ended up with his religious commitments. And indeed, Cindy, his wife, has said some very nice things about him being at peace with God, and indeed a very full, rich, and traditional, if you will, Southern life.
And she did say, in fact, she said, I can't imagine life without Andy, but I know he is with the Lord, that he loved his Lord, he made peace with God. She said this after he died, and talking about how important that was to him. And in fact, I remember reading an interview with him about 20 or 25 years ago, after he had that illness you referred to, which completely incapacitated him for a while. Yeah. And they asked him if that had affected his attitude. He said, no. He said, I'm still grateful that I was given a talent.
Absolutely.
And I see my job on earth to respect that talent and hone it and love it. And he saw this not as a way to make money, but as a way to show respect for people,
give back,
create something for people that they would enjoy. And Ron Howard talked about that theme, that he created a set for them, and him, including Ron Howard as a child, that was full of joy. But also Ron used that word again, a respect for what we were doing for the people and a respect for the audience. And Andy said the difference between the Andy Griffith Show and the other comedies of the time was, we want people to laugh with us, not at us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think one of the greatest commentaries on the value his life left, because, Hutch, when you think about what's the meaning of your own life, material things pass. It's really what people remember and think of you as an individual. In 2001, a major poll in North Carolina asked, who was the most well-recognized, most respected, best-known personalities in the state of North Carolina, and by North Carolinians. And basically he came in third after Dean Smith,
Yes.
Reverend Billy Graham and Andy Griffith.
That's a nice trifecta there. And I think everybody would agree with the order there. And it's wonderful having this discussion, because one thing that you and I observed, and you even more having known him, was when people go into Hollywood with the amount of money to be made, with the amount of ego fuel that is available there, he was one of the rare people for whom Hollywood did not change him. He always operated in Hollywood on his terms. And then, as you mentioned, when it came time for Matlock and he had that much influence, he took Hollywood home with him.
He did. And when he was living in Los Angeles, he lived in a smaller community. I think it's Toluca Lake. I had an opportunity out there on a medical meeting to go and visit his parents once he relocated them to Los Angeles. He moved both parents there and looked after them until they passed away, a few years later. But anytime he could, he brought it home. And he always came home to Manteo, which is where his first real job was, in the Lost Colony. And he loved the place, and he spent his life there. He spent it in North Carolina, and he's done so much for the University of North Carolina and for the Grace Moravian Church in Mount Airy and so forth.
And I will wrap mine up, and then I want to hear some final thoughts from you, with a wonderful remembrance of the fact that he is probably the last of the major actors on that show to go. Another one, George Lindsay, who was Goober, died in May.
He did.
And Andy left a message, or offered a message to the funeral home there, and asked them to put it on the website so everybody could see it. He said, George and I have been friends all of our lives, even sweeter friendship toward the end. And Andy said one thing that I'm very proud of is we were very comfortable saying, I love you. And that's the last thing we said to each other before he passed away.
That's correct. And it is, as we'd say in the South, it's very sweet. It's very sincere. Thelma Lou, the actress who plays Thelma Lou, is actually relocated, lives in Mount Airy now.
And I think the one who played Barney's girlfriend is still alive too.
Well, that's Thelma Lou.
That's right.
That's Thelma Lou. That's Thelma Lou.
So, and Andy's girlfriend was?
Well, it's Helen Crump on the show. I don't know. I've not seen anything about the lady that played her. But Thelma Lou's a very visible personality in Mount Airy now. Mm-hmm. She actually led a press conference on Wednesday once it was announced, and she's still there. Still has that wonderful voice. Changed appearances we all have over the years. But
that's
unfortunately,
wonderful.
About the rest, I do think most of the other majors people have passed away.
I think Aunt B, Frances Bavier, was one of the first ones to go. She was originally a Broadway actor who had never been to the South, but loved the tone of the show so much she moved to North Carolina,
Siler City.
Lived out her years there.
Actually, had received her health care at UNC hospitals for a number of years.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate you coming in, because Andy is one of these whom anyone, but particularly we in the South, can be very proud of, that he took the Southern culture, the Southern spiritual foundations, the Southern gentlemanly attitudes, and courtly ways of the way Southerners were 30, 40, 50 years ago, and took that to Hollywood and stayed in that mode all of his life. It didn't change him.
And he stayed the course. He never changed his persona, which was, I think, reassuring, very private person, but indeed, that's an appropriate way to be. And he was really someone that gave back throughout his life.
Opened doors for a lot of people, and always acknowledged God as the one who opened the door for him.
Absolutely.
His entire career. Dr. Mike Moore, thank you so much. It's been nice to have you in here, and I want to thank once again Dr. Ashby for tracking you down. You're a busy man.
My privilege, Hutch, anytime.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you, sir.